I spent 5 years building an empire out of the ashes of my rejection, only to have my fated mate crawl back to me. Not to claim me, but to beg for the very life of the woman he replaced me with. Hi! Welcome to Vine Romance, where love speaks and hearts connect. If you believe in beautiful love stories, hit subscribe, like, and comment. And kindly join our growing family. Let's grow in love together. Chapter 1. The branding iron hissed against her skin, and in that moment, the world shifted. It wasn't just the smell of scorched fur or the blinding white heat that shattered Lyra's heart. It was the way Thorn looked at her, cold, distant, and utterly devoid of the love that had once promised her a kingdom. He stood on the high stone dais of the blood oak pack, his massive frame casting a shadow over her trembling form. He didn't look like a mate. He looked like a butcher. "I, King Thorn of the Blood Oak, reject you," he declared, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Lyra's very marrow. What followed was the sound of 1,000 hearts breaking, or perhaps it was just hers. She looked up through the haze of tears and saw the woman standing beside him, a sleek northern wolf with eyes like polished ice. Lyra smirked, her hand resting possessively on Thorn's bicep. Not only that, but the pack elders nodded in approval, their silence a collective blade in Lyra's chest. They wanted a political alliance, and Lyra, a girl with nothing but a fated bond, was a debt they couldn't afford to keep. She felt it, etched in fire, the moment the bond was supposed to snap. Yet beneath the agony of the silver-laced brand, something didn't feel right. The heat didn't dissipate. It coiled deep inside her, turning from a warm glow into a hard, cold stone. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't scream. Her wolf, usually so vocal, went silent, retreating into the darkest corners of her mind, as if hiding from a predator. Moments later, the guards dragged her to the edge of the territory. They tossed her into the mud like a piece of refuse. Lyra didn't move for a long time. She lay there, the rain washing away the blood but not the shame. Because she had no pack, she was a fugitive. Because she had no mate, she was a ghost. To make things worse, the forest itself seemed to turn its back on her, the trees whispering of her failure. Eventually, she stood up. Her body moved on instinct, carrying her away from the only home she had ever known. She didn't head for another pack. She headed for the gray stone walls of Oakhaven, the city where wolves pretended to be men. She promised herself one thing as she crossed the threshold. She would never shift again. If her wolf was the reason she could be hurt, then the wolf had to die. 5 years later, Lyra stood at the window of the merchant's spire, watching the sun set over the bustling streets of Oakhaven. She was no longer a broken girl in the mud. She was the human queen of tech, a woman whose name was whispered with fear and respect in boardrooms. She wore a high-collared dress of midnight silk, the fabric thick enough to hide the jagged scar on her shoulder. Truth be told, she hadn't felt the touch of another wolf in years, and she preferred it that way. As the silence stretched, her assistant, a nervous human named Peter, knocked on the heavy oak door. "The petitioners from the Blood Oak Kingdom are here, ma'am," he stammered, his eyes glued to the floor. Lyra's heart skipped. It was a physical reaction she hated, a remnant of a life she had buried. "They look desperate," Peter added, They say their lands are dying. What's worse, she already knew. She had spent 5 years building an empire of logistics and trade just so she could keep her thumb on the pulse of the great packs. In fact, she had been the one quietly redirecting the grain shipments away from Thorn's borders for months. It wasn't just business. It was a slow, methodical starvation. She wanted them to feel a fraction of the emptiness he had left in her. "Let them wait," Lyra said, her voice a cool, melodic rasp. She turned back to the window, her fingers tracing the outline of a gold coin on her desk. Still, her wolf stirred. It was a faint, restless movement, like a dreamer turning in sleep. Lyra suppressed it with a practiced mental shove. She didn't need the wolf to handle this. She needed the cold, calculating mind of a woman who had learned that gold was stronger than blood. Before she could move, a sudden chill swept through the room. It wasn't the air conditioning. It was a psychic pressure, a weight that made the oxygen feel thin. The brand on her shoulder began to tingle, a dull, rhythmic throb that matched a heartbeat. She didn't know what scared her more, that he was here, or that her body still recognized him. Without warning, the doors to her office didn't just open. They were thrown wide. 2 of her elite human security guards were tossed aside like ragdolls. In the span of a breath, the room was filled with the scent of pine needles, wet earth, and a raw, masculine power that made Lyra's vision blur. Thorn stood in the doorway, and in a single heartbeat, the world shifted. He wasn't the proud, golden king she remembered. He was thinner, his beard unkempt, and his eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion. Yet, the Alpha Authority still rolled off him in waves, thick and suffocating. Behind him, a few of his remaining council members hovered, looking terrified. "I am not here for games, Merchant Queen," Thorn growled, his voice a jagged edge that sliced through her composure. The moment their eyes locked, Lyra felt the air thicken. He didn't recognize her. How could he? She wore her hair differently. She smelled of expensive chemicals instead of the forest, and her face was partially veiled by the shadows of the high-backed chair. Deep down, she knew the truth. She could end him right now. She could call the city guard, have him arrested for trespassing, and watch him rot. Instead, she leaned forward, letting the light catch the sharp line of her jaw. "You are in my city, King Thorn," she said, savoring the way his name felt like a curse on her tongue. "In Oak Haven, you are not a king. You are a debtor who hasn't paid his interest." As if pulled by a string, Thorn stepped closer, his nostrils flaring. He was searching for something, a scent, a memory. But Lyra had spent years soaking in wolfsbane-laced baths to kill her aroma. Because of that, he found nothing but the cold smell of iron and ink. "My people are starving," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. "The blight is spreading. If we don't get the shipments, the pups won't survive the winter." Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just her own cruelty, but Lyra felt a surge of triumph. She didn't care about his pups. She didn't care about his blight. Beneath the moonlight filtering through the glass, she saw the man who had destroyed her life, and he was finally on his knees. "I will give you what you need," she whispered, the words hanging in the air like a trap. "But not for gold. I want you to stay here. in this city, as my servant." Beside her, the silence roared. She waited for him to roar back, to shift and tear her throat out. Rather, Thorn just bowed his head, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. "Whatever you ask," he choked out. "Just save them." Lyra smiled, but her chest ached. She had won, but as the bond pulsed between them, she realized the war was only just beginning. Thorn's head stayed bowed, and as the silence stretched, Lyra felt the first true intoxicating hit of power. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just watched the great king of the Blood Oak Pack stand in the center of her glass and steel temple, reduced to a common beggar. Soon after, she signaled Peter to bring the contracts, her movements fluid and predatory. She needed him to sign away his dignity before the sun rose, because she knew that once the moonlight faded, her own resolve might soften. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a low chair that forced him to look up at her. Next, she pushed a heavy parchment across the desk, the ink still wet and smelling of chemicals. Thorn didn't even read the lines. In fact, his eyes were fixed on her hands, watching the way her fingers moved with a grace that seemed too familiar. Despite that, he reached for the quill, his large, calloused hand trembling slightly against the delicate wood. What followed was the scratch of a pen that sounded like a death warrant. He signed it. He actually signed it, which meant that for the next 30 days, the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories belonged to the woman he had discarded like trash. Lyra felt a shiver of icy delight race down her spine. Still, the brand on her shoulder began to throb with a dull, insistent heat, as if the silver mark were protesting this perversion of their bond. "Peter will show you to the servants' quarters," Lyra said, her voice like a velvet whip. "You start at dawn. You will scrub the floors of the foyer where you kept me waiting. You will serve the tea to the merchants who come to buy the grain your people so desperately need." Thorn didn't flinch. Instead, he stood up, his height still intimidating even in his broken state. Before she could move, he leaned over the desk, his scent, that maddening mix of musk and cedar, flooding her senses. "I don't know who you are," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that made her wolf pace inside her ribcage. "But I know what it's like to be desperate. I hope you never have to learn that lesson twice." Without another word, he turned and followed Peter out of the room, leaving Lyra alone in the dark. Come morning, the spire felt different. The air was charged with a tension so thick, it felt like a physical weight against Lyra's skin. She sat in the breakfast nook, staring at a plate of fruit she couldn't eat. From there, she could hear the rhythmic sound of a brush hitting stone. It was him. He was out there, on his knees, scrubbing the marble floors of her empire. She didn't know what scared her more, his presence or her own obsession with it. She found herself walking to the balcony, looking down at the foyer. Thorn had stripped off his heavy tunic, his muscular back glistening with sweat as he worked. Truth be told, he looked more like a god than a servant. Her eyes traveled down his spine, stopping at the jagged red scar that peeked out from his waistband. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She saw it. It wasn't just a wound. It was a mirror image of her own brand. He had marked himself. Because of that, her breath caught in her throat. Why would he carry the weight of her rejection on his own skin? Before the words left her lips, she shook the thought away. It didn't matter. He was a liar. He was the man who had burned her. As the sun rose higher, the first of the merchant lords arrived for the day's negotiations. Lyra watched from the shadows as Thorn stood, wiped his hands on a rag, and opened the door for a fat, arrogant human trader named Silas. Not only that, but Silas, knowing Thorn was a wolf, deliberately spat on the floor Thorn had just cleaned. "Missed a spot, beast," Silas sneered, his voice echoing through the hall. Lyra's blood boiled, her instincts surged, her wolf clawing at her throat, demanding she leap down and tear the human's head off for such a slight against an alpha. Yet she stayed her hand. She watched Thorn. He didn't growl. He didn't shift. He simply knelt back down and wiped the floor clean, his expression a mask of stony endurance. By the time the afternoon heat settled over Oakhaven, Lyra was a nervous wreck. She had spent the day watching Thorn endure humiliation after humiliation. She had expected to feel joy. Instead, her chest ached with every step he took. She called him to her office under the guise of instruction, needing to see him up close to remind herself why she hated him. "You're late with the tea," she snapped as he entered, her voice trembling more than she liked. Thorn carried the tray with a steady hand, placing it on the low table between them. As if fate demanded it, the sleeve of her dress slipped, revealing a fraction of the silver brand on her shoulder. The moment their eyes locked, the space between them burned. Thorn froze, his pupils blown wide, his nostrils flared, drawing in the air like a drowning man. "That mark," he breathed, his voice a ragged ghost of a sound. "Where did you get that?" No matter how hard she tried, Lyra couldn't look away. Her world tilted. The mask was slipping. She could feel her wolf pressing forward, sensing its mate, wanting to howl in recognition. "It was a gift," she spat, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "From a king who didn't know the value of what he had." Without thinking, Thorn reached out. His fingers were inches from her skin, his heat radiating through the air. "Lyra," he whispered, and the way her name left his lips shattered the last of her icy composure. But then the door burst open. A beat later, Ilara stepped into the room, her fur-lined cloak billowing behind her. She looked from Thorn to Lyra, her eyes narrowing with a predatory intensity that made the hair on Lyra's neck stand up. "Thorn, darling," Ilara purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The council is wondering why you're playing house with a human merchant while our borders are being raided." Under the weight of his stare, Thorn pulled back, his face hardening into a mask of duty. Lyra felt the rejection all over again, sharper than the first time. In the stillness that followed, she realized Ilara wasn't just there to find her husband. She was there to finish what she had started 5 years ago. Shadows danced between them as Lyra stood her ground, her hand moving instinctively to the hidden dagger beneath her desk. The peace was over. The hunt had begun. Ilara's presence was a cold draft that extinguished the heat of the moment, and as the silence roared, Lyra felt the old walls of her heart snap back into place. Thorn's hand, which had been seconds away from touching the ghost of his own cruelty on her shoulder, dropped like a lead weight. He didn't look at Lyra anymore. He looked at the floor, his alpha pride folding under the suffocating pressure of his duty to the woman he called his queen. "I was merely securing the logistics of the first shipment, Lyra," Thorn said, his voice a hollow shell of the growl that had vibrated against Lyra's skin moments before. What followed was a look of such sharp, icy triumph from Lyra that Lyra had to grip the edge of her desk to keep from shifting. The northern bitch stepped further into the room, her scent, a cloying, artificial musk of winter lilies, clashing violently with the primal pine of Thorn's wolf. "Is that so?" Lyra purred, her eyes raking over Lyra with the clinical detachment of a butcher. "You seem to be securing quite a lot of her time, Thorn. In fact, one might think you were enjoying the company of this human." She spat the word like it was a piece of rotten meat. Lyra didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back into her throne of power, her face becoming a mask of stone-cold indifference. "The king is merely a diligent servant, Lady Lyra," Lyra said, her voice a melodic blade. "In Oakhaven, we value efficiency over titles. If you find my methods distracting, you are more than welcome to settle his debts and take him back to your starving forest." Still, her heart was racing so hard she was sure they could hear it. Lyra's smile didn't reach her eyes, which were darting toward the silver-laced scar peeking from Lyra's silk sleeve. Before either could speak, Lyra moved with a speed that hinted at her true nature. She didn't strike, but she leaned over the desk, her face inches from Lyra's. "Be careful, little merchant," she whispered, the subtext of her threat vibrating in the air. Wolves don't like it when humans play with their things. They tend to bite." Lyra didn't move a muscle, but beneath the desk, her claws began to ache, pressing against the pads of her fingers as her wolf stirred in a frenzy of territorial rage. That night, the spire felt like a cage. Lyra sat in her private library, the only room where the air didn't smell like Lyra's perfume. She was trying to focus on the grain ledgers, but the numbers blurred into images of Thorn's scarred back and the way he had whispered her name. Deep down, she knew the truth. Lyra was more than a political mate. There was something wrong with her scent, something metallic and sharp, like the silver powder they used to kill rogue wolves. Between one breath and the next, a shadow fell across the doorway. Lyra didn't have to look up to know who it was. The bond pulsed, a rhythmic throb in her shoulder that felt like a beacon in the dark. Thorn stepped into the room, his movements quiet for a man of his size. He wasn't wearing the servant's tunic now. He was bare-chested, his skin bronzed by the city sun. "You shouldn't be here," Lyra said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "The servants' quarters are 3 floors down." Thorn didn't stop until he was standing right over her, his heat a physical force that made her bones remember him. "I saw the mark, Lyra," he said, and the echo of his voice was enough to make her world tilt. "I have spent 5 years dreaming of the girl I branded. I have spent 5 years praying that she survived the wilderness I cast her into. Because of that, Lyra felt a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. She stood up, her chair screeching against the floor, and shoved him back with all her strength. "Don't you dare!" she hissed, her eyes flashing gold in the dim light. "Don't you dare act like the victim! You chose her! You chose the throne! You chose to burn me so you wouldn't have to look at the face of the woman you betrayed!" Rather than fighting back, Thorn let her hit him. He took her rage like a man standing in a storm, his eyes never leaving hers. "I did," he admitted, the words a jagged confession that tore through the air. "And I have lived in a world of gray ever since. But you're not a ghost. You're a queen." In that moment, the space between them burned. He reached out, his hand finally closing over her scarred shoulder, his thumb tracing the jagged lines of the brand. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Lyra realized that no matter how much she hated him, her soul still answered his call. "Come morning." The tension broke in a way Lyra hadn't expected. She was in the counting house at the base of the spire when the first alarm rang out. A group of northern mercenaries, wolves who bore the mark of Alara's father, had breached the city's outer gates. They weren't there for grain. They were there to reclaim their stolen king and wipe the human queen off the map. Without thinking, Lyra grabbed the silver-handled dagger from her belt and ran toward the foyer. The air was thick with the scent of blood and wood smoke. She saw Thorn in the center of the hall, fighting off 3 attackers at once. He was a blur of muscle and fury, but he wasn't shifting. He was fighting as a man, his movements hampered by his refusal to let the beast out in her city. "Shift, you fool!" Lyra screamed, throwing her dagger and burying it in the shoulder of a wolf lunging at Thorn's back. But then she saw why he wouldn't. Lyra was standing on the staircase, a small vial of black liquid in her hand. She was misting the air with it, wolfsbane concentrate. If Thorn shifted, the poison would hit his bloodstream instantly, stopping his heart. What's worse, Lyra felt her own wolf beginning to choke. The poison was in the vents. Her vision swam, and her knees buckled as the room began to spin. To make things worse, the mercenaries were closing in, their eyes glowing with a feral, murderous light. "Lyra!" Thorn's voice cut through the haze. He abandoned his defense, taking a brutal claw swipe to the ribs just to reach her side. He pulled her against his chest, his scent the only thing keeping her conscious. Beneath the weight of his stare, Lyra saw the plan in Alara's eyes. This wasn't just a raid, it was a harvest. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Lyra realized she couldn't win this as a merchant. She couldn't win this with gold or logic. She looked at Thorn, her fingers digging into his arms. "The tunnels!" she gasped, her breath catching as the wolfsbane scorched her lungs. "Behind the tapestry! Go!" She felt it, etched in fire, the moment she chose his life over her secret. As the darkness closed in, she saw Ilara's face twist in rage, and she knew that their hidden war had just turned into a high-speed chase through the bowels of the earth. The heavy velvet tapestry muffled the sounds of the massacre behind them. And as the silence roared in the narrow stone passage, Lyra felt the weight of Thorn's body leaning heavily against her. The air in the secret tunnels was damp and smelled of ancient earth, a sharp contrast to the poisoned mist filling the spire above. She gripped his waist, her silk dress already ruined by the blood seeping from the deep gashes in his side. Even so, she didn't slow down. She knew every turn of these catacombs because she had designed them as a final escape from a past she thought she'd outrun. "Keep moving," she hissed, her voice trembling as the adrenaline fought the lingering effects of the wolfsbane. Thorn stumbled, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches that made her chest ache with every step he took. What followed was a series of sharp turns through the darkness. their only light coming from the glowing silver lichen that clung to the damp walls. Not only that, but the psychic weight of the bond was pulsing through the brand on her shoulder, thrumming with a frantic, terrified rhythm that wasn't hers. It was his. Still, they couldn't stop. They could hear the muffled baying of northern wolves echoing through the stone, their claws clicking against the floorboards of the spire far above. To make things worse, Lyra realized her own internal compass was spinning. Her wolf was no longer hiding. It was pacing at the front of her mind, snarling at the scent of the enemies who had dared to touch her mate. Truth be told, the human queen was dying, and the beast was clawing its way back to the surface. Moments later, they reached a small, hidden chamber deep beneath the city's foundations. Lyra shoved the stone door shut and barred it with a heavy iron rod. From there, she turned to Thorn, who had collapsed against the wall, his face as pale as the lichen. Because of the silver-laced claws that had struck him, his wounds weren't closing. The poison was eating him from the inside out. "Look at me, Thorn," she commanded, kneeling between his legs and ripping her silk hem to create a bandage. Her body moved on instinct, her fingers working with a surgical precision she hadn't known she possessed. What followed was a low, pained groan from the man who had once been her world. He reached out, his hand shaking as he cupped her cheek, his thumb catching a stray tear she didn't even know she'd shed. You're still her," he whispered, his golden eyes searching hers with a desperate, hungry focus. "The fire in your eyes. It never went out." Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she pressed the fabric into his wound, causing him to hiss through his teeth. She didn't know what scared her more, the thought of him dying, or the realization that she still wanted to be the one to save him. That night, the small chamber felt like a sanctuary and a tomb all at once. Thorn drifted in and out of a fevered sleep, his hand never letting go of hers. While the forest held its breath above them, Lyra sat in the dark, watching the way his chest rose and fell. She found herself staring at the matching scar on his chest, the one he had carved into himself. Maybe it was fate that had brought them back to this point, stripped of their crowns and their gold, left with nothing but the raw, bleeding truth of what they were. In the stillness that followed, Lyra decided to do something she hadn't done in 5 years. She closed her eyes and reached out through the bond. As the bond pulsed, she felt a sudden, sharp spike of ice. It wasn't Thorn's pain. It was a cold, calculating presence nearby. Before she could move, she realized the connection was leaking. She wasn't just feeling Thorn. She was sensing the person he was bound to by political law. What's worse, the vision hit her like a physical blow. She saw through Alara's eyes. The queen wasn't mourning her husband or searching for him. In fact, she was standing in Lyra's office, talking to the Northern Alpha, the man who was supposed to be her father's enemy. Except he wasn't. They were lovers. Lyra was laughing as she poured a vial of the blight into Oakhaven's main water reservoir. "Once the city falls, the Blood Oak line ends with him," Lyra whispered in the vision, her voice dripping with the venom that made Lyra's blood run cold. "And the trade routes will be ours." In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The midpoint of her revenge had turned into a revelation of total catastrophe. It wasn't just about a rejected mate or a failing kingdom. It was a planned extinction. Not only that, but Lyra realized the blight wasn't a natural curse. It was a biological weapon designed to weaken the wolves so they could be harvested for their pelts and their power. By the time Thorn woke, the sun was likely rising above the ground, though the tunnels remained eternally gray. He looked stronger, his wolf's natural resilience finally fighting back the silver. But then he saw the look on Lyra's face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice returning to its alpha rasp. "What did you see?" As the truth unraveled, Lyra told him everything. She didn't use the voice of a merchant. She used the voice of a Luna. She told him of the betrayal, of the lovers in the dark, and of the poison in the water. Between them, something cracked. The last of the lies fell away, leaving Thorn staring at her with a mix of horror and newfound worship. "I gave her my kingdom to protect my people," Thorn whispered, his fist clenching until his knuckles turned white. "And she turned it into a slaughterhouse." "She didn't just take your kingdom, Thorn," Lyra said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low pitch. "She took my city, and no one takes what is mine." As her wolf stirred, she felt a growl rise in her throat, a sound she hadn't made in half a decade. She didn't care about the board meetings or the silk dresses anymore. Without thinking, she stood up and reached for the latch on the door. Despite that, Thorn was there in a second, his body blocking her path. "You can't go out there alone," he said, his eyes burning with a protective intensity that made her breath catch. "They have an army. They have the silver mist." "Then we don't fight as humans," Lyra replied, her voice steady. "And we don't fight as two separate packs." She stepped into his space, the air thickening until the space between them burned. "We fight as one." In the quiet that followed, she reached up and traced the mark on his chest, her fingers tingling as the soul bond finally roared back to life. No matter how hard she tried to deny it, she was the other half of his soul. And it was time the world remembered why a diamond wolf was the most dangerous thing in the forest. Thorn's hand covered hers against his chest, and as the bond pulsed, Lyra felt the last of her human reservations incinerate. The cold, logical CEO was gone, replaced by a predator who had finally remembered the taste of blood. Soon after, she pulled away, the damp air of the tunnel suddenly feeling too small for the power radiating between them. She knew the risks. If they stepped out of these shadows, they were walking into a trap designed to kill their kind. Yet she had never felt more alive. "The water reservoir is the heart of Oakhaven," Lyra said, her voice a low, steady chime that brooked no argument. "If we don't neutralize the blight by sunset, every wolf in this city will be too weak to stand, and Alara's northern wolves will move in for the kill." Next, she moved to a hidden alcove in the stone wall, pulling out a leather satchel filled with vials of concentrated lavender and charcoal. Her own secret research into neutralizing wolfsbane. Still, her hands were steady. She didn't know what scared her more, the army waiting above, or the fact that she was willing to die for a man who had once broken her. What followed was a silent, grim preparation. Thorn watched her with a look of raw, unshielded reverence, his golden eyes tracking every move of her hands. In fact, he looked like a man who had just found water in a desert. To make things worse, The sound of scratching paws echoed from the ventilation shafts above, reminding them that the clock was ticking. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the bond was humming a low, ancient song of war, urging her to claim the alpha standing before her. "I need you to listen," Lyra whispered, turning to face him. "The reservoir is guarded by silver-laced gates. Because I am a human citizen, I can get us through the first layer of security, but once we reach the water, Ilara will know." Thorn stepped closer, the heat of his body acting like a magnet to her senses. Because he was a king, he knew the weight of sacrifice. Because he was a mate, he knew the weight of her fear. "I will be your shadow, Lyra," he promised, his voice a jagged rumble in the small chamber. "Let them look at the king they think they've broken. While they watch me, you strike." That night, they emerged from the tunnels into the industrial district of the city. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and the faint, bitter tang of the blight. Lyra led the way, her silk dress replaced by a practical dark leather tunic that allowed her to move like a ghost through the shadows. Behind her, Thorn moved with a predatory silence that belied his size. Every step he took was a testament to his recovery, his wolf sensing the proximity of the fight. As the silence stretched, they reached the iron perimeter of the reservoir. Not only that, but the guards were not her city watch. They were Ilara's northerners, their eyes glowing with a sickly, enchanted yellow. Before she could move, Lyra felt a wave of nausea hit her. The poison was already in the air here. It was a calculated risk, but in a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She saw a young pup, no older than 6, shivering in the shadows of a nearby alley. His eyes glazed with the fever of the blight. Something inside her shifted. The human queen who only cared about ledgers died in that alleyway. Her soul answered the child's silent plea with a snarl that nearly escaped her throat. She looked at Thorn and gave a sharp nod. It was time to commit. "Stop! Identify yourself!" a guard barked as they stepped into the torchlight of the main gate. Lyra didn't slow down. She kept her head high, the authority of 5 years of rule vibrating in her voice. "I am Lyra of the Spire," she declared, her voice a whip crack in the night air. "And I am here to inspect the water quality after your queen's clumsy arrival." The guards hesitated. In fact, they were used to her being the one in charge. But then, one of them recognized the massive, scarred man standing behind her. "The king?" the guard gasped, reaching for his silver-tipped spear. In that moment, the tension broke. Thorn didn't wait for them to strike. He lunged, a blur of muscle and fury, taking down the first 2 guards before they could even draw breath. Meanwhile, Lyra sprinted for the control valves. She could see the black sludge of the blight dripping into the crystalline water of the reservoir. It was a sight that made her stomach churn. Without thinking, she began pouring her neutralizing agent into the flow, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. Moments later, a piercing, high-pitched howl echoed across the water. Ilara appeared on the overhead catwalk, her face twisted in a mask of pure, demonic rage. "You stupid, arrogant bitch!" she screamed, her voice amplified by the metal of the reservoir. "You think you can save them? You're just a rejected stray playing at being a queen." As her wolf stirred, Lyra looked up and smiled, a slow, terrifying baring of teeth. "I'm not playing, Ilara," she called back. I'm reclaiming my territory." To make things worse, Lyra didn't come down alone. She signaled to the shadows, and a dozen more mercenaries emerged, surrounding Lyra and Thorn at the edge of the deep, dark water. The air thickened until the space between them burned. Lyra felt the brand on her shoulder flare with a white-hot intensity, a signal that the bond was ready to fully ignite. She looked at Thorn, and for the first time, she let the connection wide open. "Fight for me," she whispered into his mind. "Always," his soul answered. Between them, something cracked, the last barrier of their separation. They were trapped, outnumbered, and standing at the edge of a poisoned abyss. Yet as the moon broke through the clouds, Lyra felt a roar rising in her chest. There was no turning back now. The merchant queen was gone, and the Luna of the Blood Oak had finally come home to hunt. The moon was a cold, mocking eye in the sky, and as the silence roared, Lyra felt the trap snap shut around them. Lyra stood on the catwalk, silhouetted by the pale light, looking down at them like a goddess of ruin. Lyra's hands were still wet with the neutralizing agent, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had committed to this path, yet the air suddenly felt like it was made of lead. "Did you really think it would be this easy?" Lyra laughed, and the sound was a jagged blade of glass in the dark. What followed was a signal, a sharp, more shrill whistle that echoed off the metal walls of the reservoir. Soon after, the water beneath the catwalk didn't just ripple. It began to churn with a violent, unnatural foam. Not only that, but the neutralizing agent Lyra had poured in began to glow with a sickly neon green light. In fact, she hadn't neutralized the blight. She had triggered the final stage of its transformation. To make things worse, a wave of agonizing weakness washed over Lyra, forcing her to her knees. Her wolf shrieked in her mind, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Because the poison was now airborne in its most potent form, her vision began to fray at the edges. She looked at Thorn, expecting to see him fighting, but what she saw instead shattered her soul. Thorn was paralyzed. He wasn't just weak. He was staring at Lyra with wide, glazed eyes. Beneath the moonlight, a silver collar Lyra hadn't noticed before began to glow around his neck. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't reach him. Lyra realized with a jolt of horror. Lyra hadn't just used a political alliance to bind him. She had used a blood thrall curse anchored to the very brand Thorn had carved into his own chest. "Kill her, Thorn!" Lyra commanded, her voice dropping to a low, seductive purr that vibrated through the reservoir. Lyra's world tilted. She watched the man she'd finally begun to trust again turn toward her, his movements jerky and mechanical. Still, his golden eyes were there, trapped behind a veil of dark magic, screaming for help that she couldn't give. "Thorn, don't!" Lyra choked out, her voice a mere whisper as her lungs burned. What's worse, he didn't stop. He stepped toward her, his claws extending with a slow, agonizing shink. Moments later, he lashed out. It wasn't a killing blow, but it sent Lyra flying across the concrete, her head spinning as she hit the iron railing. As if pulled by a string, Lyra descended the stairs, her boots clicking with a terrifying finality. She walked past the struggling Thorn and stood over Lyra, mocking her with a look of pure, predatory satisfaction. "You were always the weak link, Lyra," Lyra hissed, kneeling to grab Lyra's hair and pulling her head back. "The fated mate, the emotional anchor. Without you, he is just a weapon, and weapons don't need hearts." In that moment, Lyra felt the last of her hope drain away. She looked around the reservoir. Her city's lifeblood was black. Her mate was a puppet, and her own body was failing her. In the span of a breath, she realized she had lost everything. Not only that, but she saw the northern mercenaries begin to move into the city streets below, their torches lighting up the night like a funeral pyre for Oakhaven. "Please," Lyra gasped, the word tasting like ash. Lyra only smiled and pulled a silver dagger from her belt, the same one Lyra had used to defend Thorn in the spire. "Don't worry, little merchant," Lyra whispered. "I'll make sure he watches while I take your head. It's the only way to ensure the bond truly breaks." Everything felt distant now. As the truth unraveled, Lyra realized her internal flaw had been her undoing. She had thought power and gold could protect her, but against this ancient dark malice, she was nothing but a girl in the mud again. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was going to die here, in the dark. And Thorn would be the one forced to watch it happen. But then, Lyra leaned in too close, her breath smelling of that cloying winter lily. "You should have stayed a ghost," she sneered. Before she could move, Lyra plunged the silver blade toward Lyra's heart. Lyra didn't fight it. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. Instead, there was a sickening thud. Thorn had moved. He hadn't broken the curse, but he had thrown his own body in the way, the silver blade burying itself in his shoulder, the same shoulder where he carried his mark of rejection. The impact threw them both toward the edge of the open reservoir. "No!" Lyra screamed, but it was too late. With a single desperate heave, Thorn grabbed Lyra and tumbled backward. Between one breath and the next, they were falling. The air was cold, the darkness was absolute, and then the icy poisoned water swallowed them whole. As the silence roared around her, Lyra felt Thorn's grip loosen. Her wolf gave one last dying whimper, and the world went black. All was lost, and as they sank into the abyss, the merchant queen finally let go of the surface. The icy water was a physical blow that crushed the remaining air from Lyra's lungs, and as the silence roared in her ears, she felt herself sinking into a bottomless black void. The poison in the reservoir burned against her skin like liquid fire, yet the cold was what truly terrified her. It was the same cold she had felt on the platform 5 years ago. Thorn's hand slipped from hers, his body drifting away like a fallen leaf in a dark current. She reached out, her fingers brushing the fabric of his sleeve before the weight of the abyss pulled her deeper. What followed was a moment of absolute stillness where the world seemed to stop. Lyra floated in the dark, her heartbeat slowing to a rhythmic throb that echoed against the brand on her shoulder. She was ready to let the water take her, because she was tired of fighting a world that only wanted to break her. But then, a voice, thin and ancient, whispered through the bond. It wasn't Thorn's voice. It was the voice of her own wolf, no longer a cowering animal, but a primal force of nature. "The fire makes the diamond harder," it snarled, repeating the mantra she had lived by. In that moment, the world shifted. Lyra's eyes snapped open beneath the surface, and instead of the murky blackness, she saw a faint, silver light radiating from her own skin. In fact, the poison wasn't killing her. Her body was absorbing it, her diamond-hard resolve turning the toxin into a fuel for her final transformation. Because she had spent years suppressing her nature, the sudden release was like a dam breaking. Her bones began to pop and realign with the violence that made the water around her boil. Moments later, she surged upward. She wasn't just swimming. She was a streak of silver light cutting through the darkness. She found Thorn's limp form and clamped her jaws onto his tunic, her new, sharper teeth holding him with a fierce protectiveness. With every heartbeat, she pushed toward the surface, the weight of the water no longer a burden, but a playground. She burst through the surface of the reservoir, a massive silver-white wolf with eyes like twin suns, and dragged Thorn onto the cold concrete ledge. Come morning, the city of Oakhaven was a war zone, but Lyra stood in the center of the wreckage like a vengeful ghost. She had shifted back to human form, though her eyes remained that haunting, predatory gold. Thorn lay beside her, breathing shallowly but alive, the silver blade removed and the wound cauterized by the heat of her own shift. Still, he was weak. She looked at the city she had built, seeing the smoke rising from the merchant districts and hearing the screams of her people. "Stay here," she whispered, leaning down to press a kiss to his forehead. Truth be told, she didn't know if she would see him again, yet she couldn't let Alara win. "I'm ending this." Soon after, she stood up and began to walk toward the spire, her steps echoing with the finality of a funeral march. She didn't need an army. She didn't need a pack. Because she was the queen of the merchant's spire and the Luna of the Blood Oak, she was a storm incarnate. What's worse, Lyra was waiting for her on the balcony of the spire, surrounded by her northern elite. The traitor queen looked down at Lyra, her face pale with a sudden flickering doubt. "You should be dead!" Lyra shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of the silence Lyra brought with her. Instead of answering, Lyra simply raised her hand. Not only that, but the strays of the city, the outcasts, the street wolves, and the human laborers, began to emerge from the shadows behind her. As if summoned by her very presence, the people of Oakhaven rose. They didn't have spears or swords, but they had the tools of their trade and the fury of the betrayed. Lyra felt the bond pulse one last time, a surge of strength that told her Thorn was standing up, miles away, rallying the remains of his own pack. Between them, something cracked the sky, a howl that began with Lyra and was taken up by 1,000 voices. "The blight is broken!" Lyra's voice carried over the wind, amplified by her wolf's power. "The water is clear, and the Queen of Lies is finished!" Before the words left her lips, she began to run. Her body moved on instinct, her legs pumping as she scaled the side of the spire with a speed that defied gravity. She didn't use the stairs. She used the architecture of her own ambition. As the wind shifted, she reached the balcony in a single, massive leap. Lyra backed away, reaching for another vial of poison, but Lyra was faster. She didn't shift. Not yet. She wanted Lyra to see the human she had mocked. She wanted her to see the eyes of the woman who had survived the fire. Under the weight of his stare, or rather, the world stare. Lyra gripped the railing and looked Alara in the eye. "You thought I was a fugitive," Lyra hissed, her voice a low, terrifying growl. "But I was just waiting for the right moment to hunt." Without thinking, she lunged, her fingers curling into claws as the space between them burned. The final push had begun, and as the first blow landed, Lyra knew that by the time the sun set, there would only be one queen left standing in the ruins of the spire. The balcony of the spire became a stage for a dance of death, and as the silence roared between them, Lyra felt the final transformation begin. There was no more suppressing the beast. No more silver-laced tea to dull the edges of her soul. Alara's face was a mask of frantic terror, her fingers fumbling with a hidden blade, but she was too slow for a woman who had been forged in the fires of rejection. What followed was a blur of silver and shadow as Lyra lunged, her body moving on instinct, her human form shredding away in a rhythmic explosion of power. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Lyra wasn't a woman anymore. She was a prehistoric force of white-furred fury, her claws gouging the stone floor as she pinned Ilara against the marble railing. Next, she leaned in, her hot breath misting against the traitor's throat. Ilara tried to scream, but the sound was cut short by the sheer pressure of Lyra's dominant alpha aura. In fact, the air around them seemed to vibrate with the frequency of a true Luna's wrath. Because Ilara had built her power on lies, she had nothing to hold on to when the truth finally bared its teeth. "This is for the brand!" Lyra's wolf seemed to snarl through the psychic bond, a vibration that shook the very foundations of the tower. Still, she didn't kill her instantly. She wanted Ilara to see the city below, to see the northern mercenaries being torn apart by the strays and the Blood Oak survivors who had arrived like a tidal wave of vengeance. To make things worse for the traitor, Thorn appeared at the balcony's edge, his chest heaving, his golden eyes locked on Lyra with a pride so fierce it burned. The tension broke when Ilara made one last, desperate move to dive over the railing. Without thinking, Lyra caught her midair, her jaws snapping shut with a finality that echoed across the courtyard. What followed was the end of the northern threat. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of victory and rain, Lyra dropped the broken form of her enemy and turned to face her mate. She shifted back slowly, the silver fur receding into the high-collared silk of her ruined dress, her skin glowing beneath the moonlight. Moments later, Thorn was there. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He gathered her into his arms, his face buried in the crook of her neck, his tears warm against her scarred shoulder. Truth be told, the kingdom was in ruins and the city was scarred. Yet as they stood together on the heights of the spire, Lyra felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She had spent 5 years running from the ghost of this man, only to realize that the fire he had used to mark her had actually been the spark that made her a queen. "It's over, Lyra," Thorn whispered, his voice a jagged, emotional wreck. "I don't deserve you. I never did. But I will spend every breath I have left trying to earn the right to stand in your shadow." Not only that, but he stepped back and sank to one knee, bowing his head in front of the entire city. He wasn't just acknowledging his mate, he was surrendering his crown to the only person capable of wearing it. That night, the fires of Oakhaven were extinguished, replaced by the warm, flickering lanterns of a celebration. Come morning, the merger began. Lyra didn't move to the forest, and Thorn didn't stay locked in the stone city. Instead, they declared the neutral territory the new heart of the Blood Oak Empire, a place where the logic of the merchant and the strength of the wolf lived in a beautiful, dangerous harmony. As the sun rose over the spire, Lyra sat at her desk, but she wasn't looking at ledgers. She was looking at Thorn, who was busy organizing the redistribution of wealth to the starving packs. She felt the bond pulse, a steady, humming warmth that no longer hurt. Because of that, she finally reached up and touched the brand on her shoulder, no longer trying to hide it. In fact, she had it tattooed with gold leaf, turning the mark of rejection into a symbol of sovereign power. No matter how hard she tried to remember the coldness of her old life, she couldn't find it. Her world tilted toward a future where she was no longer a fugitive, but a founder. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted from a story of revenge to a story of rebirth. She was the Diamond Wolf, and as she walked toward Thorn to begin their first day of true rule, she knew that the fire hadn't just made her harder, it had made her whole. 1 year later, the merchant's spire had become a palace of glass and ivy. Lyra stood in the balcony, watching a new generation of pups play in the courtyard alongside human children. The blight was a distant memory, and the northern packs had been absorbed or neutralized by Lyra's superior trade strategies. Under the weight of his stare, she turned to find Thorn watching her, his eyes filled with a love that was no longer a burden. "The shipments are ready for the winter," Thorn said, pulling her against his chest. "And the Council of Alphas is waiting for your address." Lyra smiled, her voice a confident melodic rasp. "Let them wait a few more minutes," she said, leaning back into his heat. "I'm the one with the grain, after all." As she let it happen, the kiss that tasted of pine and power, she knew the story was finally complete. The marked fugitive was gone, and the sovereign of gold had finally claimed her throne.